And we are back at it again with the power rankings. And let me tell you, I mean, how much can change in one weekend? Because the upset after upset, crazy moments all over the place. There's a lot to go through today, and I'm looking forward to ranking all 12 CDL teams with you guys. Without further ado, we have a lot to talk about. Let's get right into this thing. Let's go. All right, so here we are per usual. We got the needs work category in the mix, contender and elite. We'll be slotting them in here kind of as it goes. Let me tell you, it gets interesting. So obviously up first, we got the Paris Legion, and no surprise here. Obviously they've made a lot of changes recently, bringing in Gravity at the end of stage 1, then bringing in Jimbo. Obviously it hasn't all gone to plan. Like this weekend, they lost 3-2 to London in the reverse sweep, which was pretty surprising. They were up even in the first place, but that was Gizmo's first games back from coming back from Europe. So they didn't have much time to scrim. There could be some reasons there. London finds their groove. They end up reverse sweeping them. And then they lost 3-1 to the new look NYSL roster. So they're in a pretty tough spot at this point. There's not a lot of really good metrics to look at here besides Temp's performances. They have the lowest average points and hard point losses. The only good thing they got going for them is that they're 2-0 in S&D round 11s. So things you love to see. But outside of that, like in all S&Ds, they're worse in like first blood percentages and getting first bloods offensively. Right now, Legion only get a first blood 44% of the time, which is the worst in the CDL. And then like on offenses, they only get a first blood on 35.5% of rounds, which in comparison, FaZe is the best in the CDL at 52.3. And they're 3-8 in control. They're 5-15 in hardpoint. It's tough stuff for the Paris Legion, to say the least. And I would imagine they try to make another roster change here at some point, probably removing Jimbo, bringing in another player. But it's really hard to see the upside with this roster at this point with the team they got. So next up is the New York Subliners, obviously coming off that massive win against the Paris Legion, where they actually won 2, yes, you heard it right, 2 hard points, because they were actually on a CDL record for 13 straight hardpoint losses, which was LAG's record was 12 last year. They bring in Paul X in his debut, comes out and looks really, really good. But really the biggest turnaround here was the slang prowess of Neptune on the map, where he looked fantastic across the board. And I mean, even in S&Ds, we saw the potential of Hydra and Neptune. And overall, like the Berlin, especially, we saw Neptune going like 21 or 25 and 11, looking incredible with some really patient plays. And maybe this is what Neptune needed. He needed to have a player like Paul X, a really like aggro player like within there to play off of him. Paul's play styles matches a little bit better with how Hydra wants to play, so it's just smoother and more efficient right now. Again, it's a win against Paris, so you can't take too much away, but so far that's a good start. You win the hard points against Paris. They still got to work on their control for sure, but this team has potential, man. They really, really do moving forward after the changes with Paul X. And I love me some Paul X, especially in Search and Destroy. Last year he was the highest rated player for me that didn't make a roster. So I'm all in on Paul X and the New York Subliners. I mean, I'm interested, man. This team is very, very, very enticing moving forward. So this is where the fun really begins here. I mean, the in the mix category is by definition mixy as it gets. And there are a lot of narratives to work with here between all the teams that are potentially involved. I'll just read off some of like the most recent results. So like Florida 3-0 the Surge in stage 3 week 1. Then the Surge beat FaZe 3-2 recently. Then LAG beat the Surge 3-1. Then LAG beat LA Thieves. Then Rocker beat LA Thieves, but then Rocker beat LAG at the major. Then Florida 3-0'd LAG. We don't have all of the same types of matches, but those are the 5 teams we're trying to deal with here and figure out how to sort them. I could literally see basically any order for these 5 teams. It's that close. At number 10, I think I gotta put the Seattle Surge there. Like, even though this team just beat FaZe and they took a bocage off OpTic in a map where, I mean, Sib and Pred looked like some of the best players in the game. This team is 1-7. 1-7 in their last 8 matches, with losses to Paris, to Breach, to Gorillas, to Florida 3-0. Like, there's just massive inconsistencies right now. It's probably the easiest, most dumbed down way to put it with Seattle. And we don't know what team we're gonna get at this point. So until we have a little bit more consistency from them on a week to week basis, it's so hard to trust them any higher than right here at number 10. And it's like, well, if I'm picking teams to compete against OpTic, then maybe Surge is way higher. But if I'm picking teams to beat NYSL or to beat Paris, Surge are way lower at this point because we don't know what we're gonna get with this squad. Inside hardpoint, sometimes it feels like Pred almost like prioritizes map control too much sometimes. Like He's like, I gotta slay, I gotta create map control, I gotta push. And he can get disconnected from the hill or from the objective or what actually needs to happen around the map. Like there was a moment, I think it was against LAG on Gavutu, and like Pred was like pushing up into the spawn when all they needed to do was kill Slasher off the zone to win the map. And like there was like 0.2 seconds left and they had 3 dead. And instead of turning around to find the 4th on the zone, which he was literally capping it at that point, he like pushed up into the spawn. Just small things like that where I'm like, not the best decision making there. And then at times that can break down. And I think that's what we're seeing with the Surge. And then S&D is also a weird situation for them as well. And like it feels like they're not converting their first bloods, or their base setups aren't converting first bloods like you want them to. And all of those things combined just create a lot of inconsistencies for them, map to map, game to game, weekend to weekend. And that's why they're at number 10, man. Even though they have some of the most talented players in the CDL, Mac, though he's been good in control, he's been absolutely just bad in S&D. And that's been a real problem for them as well. So they got a lot of things to iron out. I think over time, they're going to continue to get better and more consistent. But for now, 10's where they're at for sure. So number 9, gotta be LAG. It's a tough spot for them. I mean, LAG and then the next one here, which I mean, spoiler, LA Thieves, is pretty close. So they had actually a really nice performance here against Seattle this weekend. They won 3-1 in a really weird series because map 1 looked mega chalked. And then you're like, what is happening here? I don't know. On Tuscan, it was like really ugly. We heard their listen, and during that listening, they were getting absolutely smoked and just absolutely no trades, completely going 1 by 1 and just feeding them kills. But maybe that was a second, like when Surge thought, we got this, easy win. And then that's the second that you lose or something like that, because then LAG come out, play great Berlin, great Gavutus, and win the series. And like we saw Slasher finally like look like a dominant beast on Gavutu, and he was just going huge on both control and hard point. I get really excited about this team, especially in those regards. And when we get to see Hook making the plays and search and destroy like we did on that map on Berlin, those are types of things that get me hyped. And in the long term, I can still see the perspective or the possibilities for this team. But like, it's just so tough sometimes to trust this squad against the better teams in the game. So now at number 8 is the LA Thieves. It's insane that they're even here in the first place. So I mean, like they're now on a 4-match losing streak to FaZe, London, OpTic, and Rocker. So 3 obviously top teams and then Rocker. So it is possible, like they were up 2-0 in the Rocker. They got reverse swept. So you could see the narrative where LA Thieves bounces back and it's just fine. But the problem is their S&D is just a real problem right now. They have the worst win percentage in the CDL at 6-11 in S&D. And they're 1-4 in game 5s right now. So the ice hasn't been there. They're losing search and destroys. And it doesn't seem like there's an obvious fix. I think that's probably why I have them lower here, is because maybe you role swap Draza and Kenny, but there's not like this obvious magical fix that's going to make things better for them quickly. Envoy made so many big time plays for them in the first 2 maps. And then as the series went along, like map 5 on the Bocage in that 2v4, like Envoy, he planted for the backside of the bomb and then pushed out towards bottom tunnel to try to make a play. Bro, if you would have just sat with the squad, you would have won the round for sure. It's just the types of plays from like Envoy, or, you know, we've seen that in respawns from like Draza, where sometimes it's just really disconnected and it's not happening. And so we'll see, man. I think there's a long ways to go. I think a roster change is at least possible after stage 2, and maybe a role swap could be something they could try out here before the stage 2 major. Next up is a team that I just don't know how I feel about this squad. It's the Minnesota Rocker. Obviously, they've been on the brink of potential roster changes with the role switch with Priesta and Attach, with now Priesta on a main sub and Attach on a flex. They played the Breach and got 3-0'd, basically smoked. They lost around 11 on Bocage, which was really close. But the respawns were absolutely horrible, like terrible. And on the Berlin, they took like their sweet time to get across the map, and it was like really slow plays. They made some really odd plays that I didn't necessarily agree with on rotations as well, specifically towards P4. Then you head over to the LA Thieves match, and again, you go down 0-2, and then suddenly you bring it back. It's never chalked with Major Maniac and the Rocker and Attach. I mean, this team never feels out of it. And, you know, they win the Gavutu, win the Bocage, send it to a game 5 S&D, and it's never chalked. The team clutches up, makes the plays. And like, you know, the LAT series was a great series for Major Maniac, where it was totally wasn't against Boston. So it's like, it's just tough to get a good feel for what this team is. And you know, in their recent series, it hasn't been consistent at all. Like they reverse swept the Legion, they reverse swept the Thieves, they got 3-0'd by the Breach, and then they lost 3-1 to the Ultra. We've heard from Saint that they've been seeing it in scrims, but their matches haven't basically been anything like what they played in scrims. Like they actually have been winning like all of their respawns in scrims against top teams in the league. That's what Saint was saying. But I mean, it's not coming through in the matches so far. So it's been tough. So for example, like the Rocker in Hardpoint, like they have by far the least percentage of 50-point hills in all the CDL, of hills that turn into 50-point holes. It's just not even close. And then they're also the second worst in giving up the most 50-point holds. And so overall Hardpoints has been really, really tough for them. Wins on Hardpoints, it's been from map 4s where they win in Berlin against Legion. They won a Bocage versus Thieves, which was a really nice win. And, you know, dating back, like besides that, they lost both to Ultra. They lost the one to the Breach. They lost both to the Thieves at the Major. And then at the Major, they beat the Rocker in 2 out of 3 or whatever at Hardpoints. But man, it's just hard to see the long-term upside for this team. And I'm just not fully convinced yet, but they could beat anybody, but they could also lose to anyone at the same time. And that's what makes them so tough. So speaking of teams I don't trust, the Florida Mutineers are up next. And wow, are they good? Are they horrible? I don't know if we'll ever know. Do they look good in respawns, and are they flashy and win gunfights? Yes, to say the least. And like against OpTic, though they lost 3-0, they put on some performances, some shows, and it was really close. You see the potential of Caesar Skies Bueno and of Awakening. Really, even Dave Patty showed up big. Vivid had a little bit tougher of a series overall, but we've seen them play very well. They beat the Subliners 3-0. They beat LAG 3-0. They've beaten the Surge 3-0. Like they have a lot of wins on the board here. They lost game 5 to the Mutineers, which was really close at the Major. So in their last, 5 series, they've looked really good. And we've seen a lot of very positive signs from them. So I wouldn't have a problem if somebody had Rocker and Florida swapped. I think there's an argument for both of them. That's a series I would love to see, and hopefully we can see it soon. I like the slaying upside of Florida. They've shown overall, like at least an improvement and become a little bit more consistent. Right now, their ice is still the problem. They're 1-3 in round 11s, and they're 0-2 in game 5s. So it's been the problem losing close series, losing close maps this year. And so if they can flip that switch, find those wins in those maps, then suddenly they're really, really dangerous. But for now, we can't go any higher than they already are, because it already feels like they're inevitably going to get blown out by like Paris next time they play them at this rate. So who knows? But we'll never know. So up next, this is where it's really interesting. We're on to the contenders tier now. And I think you got to put the Toronto Ultra here at number 5. Long story short, the Ultra lost 3-2 to the Breach. They lost 3-2 to FaZe. And they were up 2-1 in both of those series this weekend. And that was coming off of CleanX. He tested positive for COVID. And so he was playing his flu game against FaZe. And he said he woke up on that Boston day feeling terrible. So, but crazy enough, he actually played pretty well in those series, regardless of being pretty freaking sick. Control's been good. Like they're 8-4 in Control on the year. And they like that Boston series, I think, was so tilting for so many people because they had every reason to win that series, or even 3-0 the Breach, because they lost the Bocage and literally they had like what, a 60-point lead or so with like 20 seconds left on the game clock, with like 30 seconds left on the hill. They needed like 20 points and they end up losing the map, and Boston clutches up, which was like just an insane. I was losing my mind watching that. Their hard points have just been so unreliable. Like you play that Bocage so close against the Breach and then you get blown out 100-point clubbed by them in the next hard point on Kavutu. So it's like, they were down like what, 125-0 after P3. And so you can't be letting stuff like that happen if you want to have a chance to win championships. And so right now, I think you got to slot them in here. I really like the prospects of this team still. They shouldn't be making any changes, shouldn't consider it all. They can still absolutely win a championship with this roster. And I think it's only a matter of time before they figure out these hard points for sure this year. Boston Breach are up next. Since losing to FaZe round 1 of the Major, they're 4-1. And it's been really, really impressive. Their only loss was that game 5 to the Ultra, obviously at the Major. And really since, we've seen the best we've seen of Tej in a long time. And not to mention in that Minnesota series, I mean, Zine, he was cooking. Jeez. We're finally seeing a Breach that's not reliant on Capsule or Nero dropping 50 bombs, ironically. He did drop a 50 bomb on that Bocage. And again, Nero, at least this weekend was a little bit more consistent than normal, but there's still some just moments of like, wow, he is just flying around the map. What is happening? And then suddenly he'll just turn up out of absolutely nowhere and just start cooking. And so it is a really interesting dynamic for Boston because like you can see the potential this team has, especially if they can start dialing in on control a little bit better, which seems to be fixable. 3-9 in control this year. If they start patching that up, I mean, suddenly they're like a legit threat to start winning 3-0s, and their S&D's been pretty good. And we've seen Capsule's just instincts in S&D are just so good. And we even saw like Thieves, I thought, just playing really patiently in S&D, and I thought like there's a level of like slow, patient play that we haven't seen from Thieves yet this year. So I was really impressed with that. So overall, I mean, I am feeling good about the Breach here as a very competitive team. The only question would be is how good of teams can they actually beat? Because right now, I mean, yeah, they beat the Ultra. I really want to see him play against a FaZe, or OpTic, or London, because we haven't seen that since the end of stage 3, where, you know, they did even have a little bit of success and were playing competitively even against those great teams. So I like the Boston Breach. They're a very fun team, to say the least, with a lot of upside. All right, we're on to the elite tier, and this up next is the London Royal Ravens. If you love London, stand up. I mean, come on, man. It's been a weird run for them because obviously with Gizmo going back because of the personal issues, going back to London for a little bit, bringing in Paul X. They beat the Subliners, they beat Thieves with Paul X. They come back, they started off really slow against Paris, had to reverse sweep them, but they made it happen. And so I'll give them a little bit of a slide for that poor performance against Paris in the first 2 maps. I think truly they were trying to get back into rhythm a little bit, and they just started off slow. And so I think the narrative makes enough sense there to kind of like let them off the hook a little bit for there. They end up playing FaZe. They lose 3-1. It'll be interesting to see how their play style and situation works out moving forward. I mean, we saw FaZe really counter them well on Tuscan. Tuscan's not, you know, not one of their best maps always, and didn't play very well on that map specifically. But like FaZe was playing really wide on rotation, and Gizmo and Afro kept getting caught, and Nasty kept getting caught early on these rotations by a player playing a credit corner or just watching and playing these lanes. I thought FaZe did a really good job of countering those things that London loves to do. And like the thing about London is that they have such a strength on Gavutu control. And so good news for them is that's just purely luck based if they play it or not. It's based on a coin flip. So teams can't veto it, they can't stop it. And because they're so good at Gavutu control, it's just a massive advantage to continue to force game 4s and game 5s in series. And like we even saw FaZe try to get innovative in how they counter these offensive attacks, and FaZe was not having any success. So, I mean, London is the best Gavutu control team. I really think that. But in the long term, I'm not sure exactly how they'll match up against FaZe or OpTic, but they're in a really good spot against basically any other team in the CDL moving forward. The only question mark would be is game 5s if things start switching for them, because currently they're 3-0 in game 5. So sometimes that's not always the most predictive stat. And so if things start switching a little bit, they lose 2 or 3 game 5s, then suddenly that's when you could have some problems where, you know, S&D's been inconsistent for them at times as if they're not playing Desert Siege. So no surprise here. At number 2 is the Atlanta FaZe. And I mean, they had a really good weekend here. They beat London 3-1. They beat Toronto 3-2. So they beat 2 of the top 5 teams this weekend. Looked really solid throughout. Wasn't as dominant as maybe some FaZe fans would want to see, especially on Gavutu control, considering they lost both of them. And they seem to have a lot of problems on that map. They just don't seem very comfortable. Even with Celium finding, you know, trying to use those spots, man. Come on now. But long story short, I mean, FaZe is really good in S&D, and they always keep hardpoint close. I mean, on the season so far, in hardpoint losses, FaZe averages 208 points, which is best in the CDL. OpTic's next closest at 201. And for comparison, Legion's at only 148 points per hardpoint loss, and Thieves are at 153 per loss. So they are significantly better than a lot of the other teams in the CDL in hardpoint and keeping it close and keeping it competitive. And then in S&Ds as well, like I mentioned earlier, their first bloods are just so good. They get 57% of first bloods in S&Ds, and on offense, they are still best in CDL at first bloods, getting 52.3% of first bloods. And then on defense, they get 61.5% of first bloods, which is also best in CDL. So that's, of course, the mixture of all of them playing really well. BZ generally gets a lot of those, but all of them do a great job of finding those first bloods. We saw on Berlin, their A pushes on Berlin are really hard to deal with. So it'll be interesting to see how teams deal with playing on Berlin. if you're not Shotzzy wall banging to A-bomb, I don't know what else you're going to do. So it is going to be really interesting to see exactly how they try to deal with that moving forward for sure. Then of course, last but not least, we got OpTic Texas at number 1. I mean, there's not really any reason to consider them not being here at this point. They did what they needed to do against all the teams they played. I mean, they beat Mutineers 3-0 this weekend. You know, they beat the Surge 3-1. They had a really close series against LA Thieves, which was maybe a little bit surprising. Naturally, teams are always gunning for the best teams in the game. And so it only makes sense that over time, the skill gap will continue to close, but it does feel like they're still the best team in the game. And we'll see this weekend how they face off against FaZe and then heading into the stage 2 major. That's gonna be really interesting. And like, to be fair though, the one weird map there was probably like the Bocage against Florida, which was really mixy. And we even saw Shotzzy and Illy not have like very good maps there, but Scump and Dashy really, you know, playing that a little bit differently than normal. And they were cooking and frying and finding the big kills. And they made a few mistakes where they like some guys slipped through, like on P3 specifically. But overall, you know, their control is still the best in the game by far overall. And I mean, their Tuscans are just nasty. So I think this team is in a really good spot. They have a lot of dominant map pools. There's not too much criticism for me on this part. Dashy's looking like probably the best player in the game right now. Shotzzy's right up there, and you can always rely on Scump and Illy to make plays. So OpTic's in a really good spot. They're the best team in the game for sure, without a doubt. So I appreciate you guys for watching this video. Check out the podcast tomorrow for predictions for this weekend and more videos coming down the pipe very soon, boys. Appreciate you guys for watching. Talk to you guys very soon. Peace.